Hello, good afternoon. It's Friday afternoon. It's the Tony and Phil show. No, it's the Dingometer. And welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design and talk about lots of interesting things that we find interesting about learning. And today is no exception, because a few months ago, Phil floated this concept of the Kuleshov effect. And I sort of looked at him blankly and went, well, what's that then? What's that got to do with learning design? Turns out, loads. So in this session, we're going to have a look at what the Kuleshov effect is, and then use it as a way to think about how you might sequence learning activities. So,
well, actually, I just want to cut across there, if I may, as this is just an informal chat.
It's an informal chat. So,
is it? Yes, it is very helpful around sequencing, but I think it's also, I think, interesting as a kind of like a light source as an idea. It actually sort of aligns very much with, I think, certainly some of the things we've been thinking about recently around employability and the skills gap, and also I would also say just around some of the conventional, normal challenges that perhaps learning designers face when they're dealing with subject matter experts, or when they're dealing with kind of the notion of thinking about a curriculum and preparing it for somebody else. I think there's just a lot here, which is why essentially I twisted Tony's arm for us to talk about this today, because I just think it's sort of helpful for us anyway to think about this effect and all of those things. So we're gonna talk probably around the houses, but that, it's a Friday, so come on.
It's Friday. Get your lunch, bring your questions, and do pop any questions in the chat as we go along, and I will bring them in at opportune moments of the discussion. So, what I thought would be helpful, just to spend a minute or so just explaining what the Kuleshov effect is, first of all. So let me just bring something up here, which is, so Lev Kuleshov was a Russian film editor in the early 20th century, and he was very much focused on the power of editing. And he said it's not the acting that matters in a film, it's the cut, and that actually all the acting was subordinate to the editing, and you could change the meaning of the acting deliberately through the editing. And he said more meaning is created by the interaction of two shots than by any shot in isolation. Which I thought fascinating. I'm sure, Phil, you've obviously used this a lot in terms of your own editing, don't you?
Well, I mean, I just think a great example of this is my stepfather, who's in his 80s. He and I would always watch movies together, and he would get very cross with me if I ever talked about any of the nuts and bolts ways that sort of meaning or narrative or story was arriving on screen. And editing was just one of those discussions we could never have, because it kind of, as soon as you talk about editing, you dismantle the illusion in front of you, and it's all about how meaning is shaped and how it's prepared, and also how confusion is produced and all of those things. So I've always been fascinated by editing. I think it's sort of, if it's done really well, it's invisible, so in many ways. And so in that respect, editing I've always thought to be absolutely about how do we shape meaning, sequence meaning, how do we project our intentions into the imaginations of other people, and it is the editor and in that sort of editorial space that happens. And so I think, just as a sidebar, if you would talk to me a little bit about learning designers and sometimes what their role is around, in the hierarchies of kind of like sequencing of information, I think that learning design and editing has a lot of, for me, a lot of parity in terms of how powerful it is, but often how unsung it is to a degree. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Comparing the learning designer to the editor, the person who is sort of editing this experience together and has oversight of the whole end to end, whereas often the students don't, and they don't necessarily need to at the start, but the learning designer is the person sort of making sure that all those activities, content, the whole thing is sequenced effectively so as to produce the intended experience.
Yeah, and absolutely that the, if you're dealing with an SME or dealing with someone who's trying to get their whole story on screen, if you like, someone who's like trying to sort of get their entire sort of opus out, sometimes their wishes or their ambitions and the editor's ambitions can sometimes be at loggerheads, and you do see that in film, sort of directors not being allowed in the editing suite, and then there are directors who like to be in the editing suite. And I think that Quentin Tarantino is an example of a director who is often in the editing suite, and I think that's often why his films seem incredibly long. It's like, get him out. But anyway, so yeah, there's definitely an interesting thing around the responsibilities and the power and the slightly different ambitions, I think, that editors / learning designers might have around kind of the people who are subject specific in that way. So
yeah, absolutely. So just to give a very quick demo of what this looks like. So this was as much for my benefit because I was working through this and just to see what it was and how it worked. So this idea is the idea is meaning's not created from two independent images, but it's from the bringing together and the juxtaposition of both those images. So on the screen we've got an image of a blank face, which was how Kuleshov did his initial experiment, and then he juxtaposed this with a second image. So in this first one, it's a blank face and some tanks, and so out of that, I instantly have a thought around what's this person thinking about. So you go into the mind of the person there, and you start to think, okay, this is what this person is starting to think about. But if that second image is money, suddenly the meaning that is inferred through that juxtaposition is very different. And again, if it's a monkey with a banana, it's different again. So it's just a very interesting way to produce meaning without having to do any explaining, if you like. And I think that is another reason why it's useful in learning design, because it's a way to cut down on the need to just talk at learners and actually not talk and leave space for them to infer their own meaning by bringing together activities and images and experiences.
I would say that is where, these effects, the ability to bring two things together in the knowledge that they are going to produce meaningfulness in the imaginations of somebody else. I think that's a confidence piece. It's a confidence piece, and I think that is why sometimes you see it sometimes in learning design context, or at least in terms of kind of teaching context, you see, because there is a failure of confidence sometimes, that kind of gap between the two experiences is removed and filled up with more content, more information, and it's a failure of confidence around have the resources I provided going to produce the intended effect in the learner. And then because you're worrying that they're not, you go and then, and you see it very much. I think you see the opposite of the Kuleshov effects in people's PowerPoint presentations. When or then you add another shot and another shot. Have I done it yet? Have I done it yet? Do they understand it yet? Do they understand it yet? And I think sometimes you definitely see that in terms of you're designing a slide deck or you're thinking about that situation. You can very quickly start to sort of remove the gaps and remove the opportunities for meaningfulness to live in the recipient, because you're just filling up your kind of shots, because you don't quite yet have the confidence that you've achieved it yet. I think that's another way that this has always resonated with me in terms of confidence and the ability for two things to produce a third thing, and to know what that third thing is, and to sort of be able to have that confidence. You don't always see that, to be honest.
Yeah, and that is I think that's why it's quite a sophisticated technique for thinking about learning, because as you say, if you are underconfident, the danger is you over-explain and you fill those gaps with content because you just think nothing's happening, and actually stuff is happening. A lot of processing is happening, a lot of meaning making is happening that you might not be aware of. But the more confidently you can place those experiences next to each other and leave that gap, the more space you can create for meaningful learning to happen.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that one of the key ways that this maps for me, and this is kind of one of the things that let's start here, because it's kind of like one of the key ways, is how I think the Kuleshov effect can tell us something about the power of facilitation. I'm just going to give you a quick film example of this. There's a very famous, so in film, there's always been ambivalence or two schools of thought around narration. So, in a movie, you're watching there, you're in the dark, and then sort of the disembodied voice of a character tells you what to think about what's happening on screen. And sort of like a very an infamous example of this is in Blade Runner. So, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, it was released like when it was first released, I think in 1982. I think someone decided that something wasn't happening in the combination of shots, that the audience might get lost, and so so Harrison Ford produced this very didactic sort of narrative to kind of hopefully make sure that nobody was left behind, to ensure that this film made sense, and that anything that was too elliptical or ambiguous was kind of sorted and resolved. And of course, it was loathed, and when Ridley Scott did his own version, they stripped it out. The director stripped it out to allow this experience to happen in the imaginations and in the minds of the audience, as opposed to someone, probably an executive, worrying that the film didn't make sense. Now, there are lots of films that don't make sense technically for lots of reasons, like poor storytelling, but I think this interesting thing around narration and facilitation and thinking about designing learning experiences. I mean, you are a huge fan of facilitation. I mean, it's one of the big things I learned from you, which is about like creating the space and holding the space. So how do you see the sort of this borrowed idea from film about the dangers of narration, sort of like trying to kind of guarantee the effect that you're producing in the heads of learners by basically telling them what to think about everything? I mean, what would be your view around that relationship to kind of learning materials and sort of like talking to people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison, because I can absolutely see how I can see the analogy of the Kuleshov effect for facilitation, because yes, if you're not thinking about facilitating learning, you're probably doing the opposite, which is you're doing too much teaching, or you're over teaching, and you're just filling that space with content, and you're talking at learners, and you're instructing them, and you're depositing information, but you are not allowing them to make sense of that and have the space to process it. And so, yeah, although I'm fairly new to the Kuleshov effect, there is a clear analogy there between or with facilitation, where as an educator, the less delivery you can do, often the better. If you can prepare a learning experience where learners are doing all the doing, your job is almost done then. The teaching that is in the preparation. You set up the environment, you set up the activities, and when learners walk into that, as much as possible, they're doing the stuff, and it's them happening to those activities and experiences. It's the juxtaposition of them and those activities that produces the meaning in them, and the less telling I have to do, the more transformative that experience is likely to be, I would think. So yeah, I think
and that's exactly how I understand it. And I don't want to sort of punch down on narration, because I think if I think about like onboarding, for example, onboarding is not where you want the Kuleshov. That's not where. That's where you need. Once upon a time, there was a room in which you'll find X, and so it's not like no boo. And I've always been very anyone who's sort of an absolutist on these issues, and absolutists in learning design is a sort of, you never do that, you can't do X, you can't do Y. That's never the answer. The answer is always like, what is the effect you're trying to produce? And so I would never say, hey, in an onboarding experience, if you can just tell people what they need to know about where to find X, then for goodness sake, tell them.
Yeah.
But if you're but this idea of like having the confidence in a sort of like a teaching space to bring up to like shot A and shot B, and then you have the confidence to bring those things together in the knowledge and with your experience, that the meaningfulness, that that they will activate each other, that these resources will activate each other in the minds of the individual, and then that activation belongs to the individual. It's sort of like, and I just know from an engagement of learners' point of view that if people puzzle something out for themselves, or they feel engaged in the making of the knowledge, then it's their knowledge, and suddenly that's where confidence lives. So again, the narration part's interesting. I think people narrate often because they don't quite know what their lesson plan was or what their learning outcome was supposed to be. They just, is it this yet? Is it this yet? Have I nailed it yet? Have I achieved it yet? Have I finished the story yet? And I think that's often where you see that kind of lots of shots, when two shots, when an editorial decision would be great. And I think that is again where learning designers and editors are in a very interesting place, because they're not sort of in the subject in their brains exactly. They're slightly subject adjacent. I think they are sometimes in a slightly more empowered place to make a really decent cut, to make an editorial decision, to sort of say, you don't need the last 10 seconds of that. You could, and it's confident, and it takes a lot of confidence, I think, around a subject matter expert to gently suggest that it could be shorter or longer, or you could lose this, or you needed to add that in. It is a confidence piece, really.
Yeah, and also, we bang a lot about empathy as the key principle in learning design, and you can see there's a really strong comparison or link there, because if you are over delivering, it's usually because or you could argue that it's because you've failed to empathize how learners are going to feel when they walk into that experience in that space, and you've not thought about all the things that are going to be shaping that experience, and so you resort to telling them about it. Because actually, you could almost not tell them anything and create an environment where the meaning is inferred in their minds, and that's much more powerful than them turning up and you just basically blasting them with information.
I mean, yeah. So the other thing that I've been, because just recently we've been talking a lot around employability, and you and I had a few conversations recently, not just between ourselves but with other people, about some of the ways in which people seek to generate the effect of employability in their courses, and they sort of do it by and then moment. So they go and they produce like a workshop, or they have they put all of their eggs into the work placement basket, for example. Like, phew, we're doing employability because we've got a work placement, or so on and so forth. And what really resonated with me was this idea again of, like, in the Kuleshov effect, you've got the first shot, in the original experiment, is this blank expression, and I think there's a threshold concept for some people here, because it seems provocative to say, I think, to a lot of people who are subject specific, to say that the subject specificity, the bit about your discipline that you think is really important, the thing that is like what students have come to do, in a sense, you could argue is like shot A, in that it's just this kind of blank, nonplussed status. And the reason why I feel that is because you go to university to learn a subject like architecture, photography, business, whatever it is, the base expectation is, like, the shrug of the shoulders is that you're going on that course to learn those skills. I mean, that's not remarkable. It's not even a very interesting proposition. I just mean that it's kind of a price of admission piece. It's the price of admission. You go to do 3 years in X, and the expectation is that you can do X. So it's not like, oh my goodness, they did 3 years and they went to a course specifically about that, and now they can do X. It's like, well, that's that. So to me, you've got this kind of idea that, in a way, that's not the most interesting shot. But this shot gets its interest from combining it with shot B. So by it gets its meaning not from the fact that suddenly you've got skills, but it's those skills in a conversation with something else, and that something else, I guess, I don't really like this phrase, you might say, is the real world. But what I would say is the world where skills meet problems, and problems test those skills. So there's kind of like this concert going on between these things. So when I think about employability, and I think about some of the shifts that perhaps higher education or people who are in charge of programs or who are very protective of that, they need to start characterizing what they're doing. And I mean this non-disrespectfully. It's a neutral shot. It's arguably neutral that HE produces skills in subject disciplines. It's like, well, that's what it's, hello. It's like, yeah, but it's like, what happens next, and in combination with this other thing. And I think that other thing is all about the scenarios that problematize and test and reframe those skills. And so I think if that is where meaning lives, if that's where confidence grows, if that's where employability begins, then why can we not produce the Kuleshov effect more often on courses by bringing skills into conflict and in conversation with scenarios that and producing a more meaningful learning experience that way? So I don't know if that's if I've lost you on the way there. But that idea of the neutral expression, shot A, being skills, it's like, yeah, it's so what? It's like that is moderated and changed by its juxtaposition with life. It's like
completely. I mean, so we did some work, didn't we, on employability, and sort of looked at why or what the structural issues might be in a curriculum that might be preventing thinking and acquisition of skills around employability from happening earlier on in the curriculum. And it doesn't feel like it's in any way impossible, but it's this idea that, so in the early years of an undergraduate degree, students are working on projects, they have briefs, they have assignments. So it's not as if they're not applying those skills to a problem, but often it's how that's framed, as if it's an overly academic exercise. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to do this project, and it's sort of very disconnected from, to use your words, the real world. But actually, in the framing, well, how that activity is framed as a shot, as in like the shot B in the Kuleshov effect, it feels like there's an opportunity there to pull employability through much more strongly into every aspect of the curriculum. So it isn't just something that happens later on, or it isn't something that happens in the work placement unit. It's happening right from the start, and you are testing those skills repeatedly and consistently against problems and bringing students into contact with problems consistently and repeatedly to see what happens, and to make them aware of how their skills are developing, but also how to make the tutors aware of how those skills are developing. And you can see that much more clearly when student with skills meets scenario plus problem, I think.
When you demonstrated, I mean, what the famous example demonstrates of the sort of the neutral shot being moderated by three very different. I mean, Hitchcock does a really good. If anyone's interested, just pop on YouTube and find a lot of these examples. But Hitchcock does an example, and of a neutral look or a gaze or an eye line being kind of moderated by specific stimuli. And I just think there's something really actionable about that. So I could imagine in the space of if I was designing a learning experience, and we've done a little bit this for sort of clients since, but you do an experience where the same skill, so you get the same skill set meets three very different scenarios in quick succession. The point of learning being that you realize that your skills are kind of they're not a fixed point. They're not a point of arrival, they're a point of departure. And I think that's the other interesting thing around. So if you look at the Kuleshov effect, that shot A, so the neutral expression, is a point of departure. It's a jumping off point, and the destination sort of like lives between that, and it's in contrast with the next shot. I think the problem with university too is that it has a slight sort of around skills. It sort of has a slight sense of it sort of, once you've got them, you're kind of boxed and ready. And actually, it's like it's an unboxing. Skills being unboxed by scenarios. It's a departure point, and I think it would be very helpful, I think, for young people or anybody to have the experience where their skills are stress tested as a changeable utility as opposed to a fixed point. Because I think a lot of anxiety and a lot of disappointment and a lot of the that phase where you leave a course and you enter the workplace, I think a lot of that unhappiness may derive from the idea that your skills, you leave with a fixed point, and the fixed point fails to achieve the effect that you think that your discipline, your discipline guaranteed, because you are now good at X, Y, and Z, you are now able to puncture and go forwards. And I think that the idea that your skills are more agile and unpredictable and sort of more useful than that is again something I sort of see here, because I think that the way that the neutral shot derives all of its importance from a storytelling point of view from what comes next, as opposed to the idea that the what's important lives in the neutral shot. Because the idea that you're important and ready because you are skilled should be the answer, but the fact is that you and I have spent 4 years now talking to the recipients of graduates to discover that the skills is that their ability to do the thing that they've been employed to do, i.e. data analysis or I don't know, whatever it is, that is totally a neutral expectation. That's the very least of it. It's like that. It's like literally no one cares that you've done 3 years and that you are really good at the thing that you did, because that's what you were supposed to come out as.
Yeah.
You know, it is the idea that somehow is like that's not neutral. It's a totally neutral position. You leave neutralized, even if you're really good. It's neutral. It's what can you meet what comes next, interestingly and sort of dynamically, and that's where I think this really, for me, is like, yeah, that really helps me see why some of the emphasis that we have around the curriculum feels a little bit like a loop, a sort of an echo chamber to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. And it reminds me, we had a conversation on a previous episode with Matt Dowling from the Freelancer Club, and we were talking about the freelancer skill set and the importance of, or basically what that was, you know, so problem solving, empathy, resilience, the ability to, you know, walk into problems and be useful. And it does feel like, as you say, HE shouldn't just be about acquiring those skills. It should be about helping students realize that they have more skills than they thought they had, and that it's that they can deploy those skills in combination. That it isn't just the technical skills that they learned on the course about data science or computer engineering or whatever. It's the ability to combine those with some of the deeply human skills around empathizing with the customer or the user, or, you know, figuring out what the wider context is, and to really see what skills they have. And they only know that when that second shot happens, when they combine their skills with that scenario, and it's like, oh, hang on, this is totally different, and how am I going to do this? I need these people, I need to talk to them, and I need to bring this together. And suddenly that's, in mobilizing those skills, that's when you really realize what skills you've got. And it isn't just they're often very they're in combination. It's not just like, oh no, I'm using this skill because that's the skill I've learned. It's like, actually, what would being useful in this situation look like? It's a whole combination of sort of professional skills, technical skills, empathetic skills, all that kind of thing. So
I mean, the sort of like the key sort of, you know, some of the key takeaways for me really are just this idea of that meaning or value takes place in the gaps. So it's in the gap. So it is neither in shot A or in shot B. It is in the space that they produce. And the interesting thing about that space is it's produced in the imaginations of the recipient. And I think that's a learner-centric position. That's the notion that the things that you are producing are combining to produce an effect in somebody else. And I know that sounds obvious, but I actually think that it's not obvious to lots that's the job that you're in. Because I think if you are I think if you've got that slightly gatekeeping vibe, if you believe that the discipline is a realm that other people need to sort of that other people need to enter, it's but like, how does the discipline enter the imaginations of other people? And that to me is a completely different. It's not like dragging people through that door. It's like pushing your discipline through their door, you know. And I think that is where I think privileging the imagination of the learner or of the recipient is something that learning designers and I quibble about that term. Curriculum designers, people who design experiences, people who are interested in producing transformations in the lives of others. And the interesting thing about learning designers is that they are often adjacent to that experience. So in that respect, because they're not the embodied voice of the discipline, I think they really have to imagine and be very confident about shot A and shot B producing an effect. You have to be very confident about that, because you're not necessarily there to sort of like produce that experience. But to me, that's the key thing. It's like it's what the editor understands, that even though you thought your story lived in a sort of didactic way, that the knowledge lived in a sort of didactic way in that textbook and in that exercise, to discover that it is actually existing in the heads and in the imagination of the learner. So therefore, they might not need all of the book. They might not need all of the experience, because it's got to happen inside of them in that sense. And I just think that is a big shift for lots of people who think they're in the business of education.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to think about how you, like you say, how you design a truly learner-centered experience, because in the Kuleshov effect, the whole point, from what I understand it, is trying to not control but predict what emotional response, what feeling will be generated in the learner, in the viewer, by these two shots.
Well, what you're trying to do, I think we use this a lot, this idea of that sort of people who are interested in learners are trying to create the conditions in which something takes place. It's what's interesting about that. It's not like the guarantee that the thing will take place. It is the conditions by which an effect is produced. So how do you produce the conditions for invention? Like in film, it might be, how do you produce the conditions for suspense? Right, now that's a very easy one. Like Jaws is a great. I mean, Spielberg in Jaws uses this effect brilliantly, because, for example, he knows that if he cuts to a POV shot of people's legs in the water, and then he cuts to a shot of a shark's fin somewhere else, your brain is putting those two things together, and you immediately think that the people in shot B are being menaced by the shark's fin in shot A, when in fact they could be geographically, spatially, entirely separate places. But he is producing the conditions by which we experience dread and suspense, and that's again, it's a confidence piece. And the other thing is, it's an imagination space. And I suppose you could say that in our lives, I mean, we come from creative arts backgrounds, and if you come from a creative arts background, sometimes the disciplines themselves are about more imaginative spaces like film or writing or music. But like, if you're dealing with data literacy, if you're dealing with kind of like, how to use AI Copilot or whatever it is that you're doing, it is no less an imagination job. So I think a lot of people might think, oh, well, these guys are talking about film, and therefore all the things they're interested in, all the work they've done is about how to sort of deal with these kind of more, narrative-based subjects. But that would be a red herring, right?
Yeah.
Producing the conditions for invention, producing the conditions for learning to take place between two learning resources, the bit in the middle, that's as true whether you are trying to sort of get someone to learn how to use Microsoft as it is how they're how to sort of like tell a story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's a fascinating tool, and it led me. I had a couple of takeaways as well, which was just in terms of like how you might use it in learning design. And I've been interested for a long time about this idea of leading with the problem, and I know we've done a lot of work on this as well. But I like this idea of sort of strategic priming, so deliberately using an activity first or a problem to make the teaching that follows more meaningful. And that's absolutely backed up by research. There was a big study done in Switzerland in sort of 2019, longitudinal study, which showed that that they did an experiment where with some students, they led with the problem first, and then the teaching happened afterwards. But because you were teaching in response to that initial experience, the learning gain was about 25% higher, 20% higher. So because something had happened in the minds of the learner when they encountered that problem, it made the second shot, the teaching, much more meaningful.
Yeah.
So it was really powerful. So
yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's sort of like, because we seek to implement these ideas in the work that we do for people. It's easy to go, well, of course, but that sort of leading by doing, or leading by experience, or producing the conditions by which teaching suddenly seems relevant. I mean, honestly, the idea that just because you're in a lecture theatre, or just because that you've chosen to study something, does not guarantee that any of your learners think what they're going through is relevant. I think they just don't. I mean, I look at a lot of level 4, and people say, no, level 4. Why are our first years so bored? Why? What? It's like, oh, don't just wait till you get to the third year, then it will all make sense. It's a bit like while it's true, and we had this chat yesterday. While it's true that and this same idea that sort of, even in a sort of like a year structure, that like the meaning of your degree doesn't exist in year one, doesn't exist in year two, doesn't exist in year three. It exists kind of in the juxtaposition of those years, but nonetheless, some of the conversations or sort of customs around expectations we might have around level 4, just teach in the hope that because people have bought into the idea that at some point this will become relevant because it's a 3-year program. I mean, come on. I mean, it's a risk, right?
Yeah. Yeah, completely. And this is the risk of over teaching. You create the conditions for boredom or resistance.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So yes, that was strategic priming, and then I love this. Yeah, this, I suppose that's the point too, the cognitive efficiency. So unless you're thinking about what happens in the minds of your learners, what happens in the gaps, the danger is that you fill those gaps with instruction or with teaching. And I think this is just as true for learning design. It's if you don't think about the spaces as much as the content, then you fill the spaces with content, and then suddenly you've got just a ton of content. So thinking about how you might juxtapose activities and leave space to reduce the amount of teaching, I think is really important. And this idea of creating gaps in an experience where students can go, oh, I don't know that now, but if I think about what happens or where I am and what this next experience is, then actually I can fill that gap with my own energy, my own momentum, by mobilizing those skills that I've learned, or that information that I've learned. So the gap is just as important as the moment of instruction. I think is really powerful.
Yeah, I think gaps is interesting because again, this reminds me, my gosh, I'm going to be 50 quite soon, which is terrifying.
Surely not.
It's true. But I remember my undergraduate dissertation, and so that was many moons ago, and I wrote on alienation theory, and I've forgotten more. I can't. What I remember most about it, all these many years later, Tony Reeves, is that the whole point about alienation is that alienation has a use. When you feel adjacent to something, you are a critical space opens up. But if you're alienated from society miserably, then you are suffering. So it always came down to the intentionality. So conscious and unconscious alienation. So conscious alienation is a critical framework, and unconscious alienation is suffering. And I think this notion of gaps, and we do a lot of end-to-end design now for people's courses, and I'm always doing gaps analysis. I'm fascinated by where you've got a perforation and you didn't expect it. So this is not like pro gaps. You're learning these more gaps in it.
With gaps everywhere.
I can hear people going already, oh, phew. So so gaps are good. It's
Teach less.
The conscious production of a space that is being produced by the choice selection of shots A and B is an intentional, learner-driven, learner-centric execution. Whereas just like going and knowing that things don't line up and that you've just got a gap in the curriculum and you don't know what to do, so you fill it with stuff that's got nothing to do with the learning outcomes or whatever. I'm not talking. I just want to be very clear.
Yeah.
That the Kuleshov effect isn't like, hey,
leave more gaps.
You can put two random things together and hope the learner does all the work. I don't think that's the case, and I think there are. I remember when I first teaching. In fact, the first course I took over, and I sort of looked at all of the kind of the shots that comprised that course. It was like, these shots have got nothing to do with each other at all. Like this is you could work to sort of do the cognitive knitting between them, but that is not the work your learner should be doing. So you've got to be so intentional, and we talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
But I think that an editor will produce intentional effects, and if they're seeking to produce confusion. So, for example, a great example would be that if you were, from a filmmaker's storytelling point of view, you wanted to show the consequence of a car crash, for example, or for somebody, then suddenly producing confusion and shots that don't sit together, because what you're intentionally doing is creating the effect of like you're communicating what it is like to feel confused. That is an absolutely different job to confusing the hell out of people because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's
So confuse. I mean, I've always said this about learning. Yeah, this is it. Yeah,
a bad edit creates confusion when confusion wasn't intended. So, but again, if you ignore the intentional sequencing in learning design, there's a danger that you just create a bad edit, and everyone's like, "What's going on?"
that is right. Because I think if we track back to some of the stuff that we've done around employability and this idea, this has been coming through again and again and again and again. That the one terrain that all people need to negotiate is the terrain of imperfection and unpredictable and being unable to predict things. Ambiguity, like social ambiguity, going into a space, doing it on a discovery mission for a piece of work to discover that you're getting conflicting conversations and you get a sense of kind of like interdepartmental politics. All of this stuff is absolutely that's the terrain of confusion. That's the terrain of ambiguity. You know, that's that, and we hear it all the time that ambiguity is a curriculum in the world. It's a book you're all going to have to read. You're all going to have to do that. So my answer to that would be, from a learning design point of view, how do you produce ambiguity in an HE or in a, you know, how do you produce situations that do not make sense? How do you intentionally design for unpredictability? And I think that is absolutely where I would say that scenario-based learning and situated, you know, using narrative and using scenario-based learning, because you can produce, therefore, just like a film editor, using shots that don't quite, where the sum total of the shots is ambiguity. That can be intentional. That's not the same as bashing stuff together and
bad timetabling.
That's not. It's not the same as like as rubbish sequencing. It is the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited actually about imperfection being an art form, the ambiguity being an art form, because that's something that editors and filmmakers and storytellers absolutely do all the time, which is creating the conditions in the imagination of the recipient, the inability to negotiate a clear outcome, but having to do the work and having to sort of empathize and move through all of the different solutions. We could do much more of that intentionally through sequencing and through fascinating and exciting design of project briefs to absolutely produce gaps that are the right gaps, because they allow people to experience unpredictability and ambiguity at level 4, for goodness sake, or you know, earlier. Because if we're not doing that, then what is all of this? What are all these insights from the real world, so-called? What value are they? We just keep hearing these insights around. We need learners to be better at imperfection and poor practice. They need to be more successful in these ambiguous spaces. That hymn sheet is being sung from all the time, and I do think there's something in this about juxtaposition, juxtaposing a very fixed, predictable skill set, like with shot B, that reframes those skills. You know, really reframes them and really challenges them, but doesn't produce a sense of incompetence. Like, oh no, this situation is completely out of my comfort zone. I feel incompetent. It's like, that would be the point of the learning experience, to give people the opportunity to go, hold on, I know what's happening here. My skills are being reframed. I'm going to walk into that space with confidence. We should be able to produce those kind of learning experiences, those vital, unpredictable, slightly free-range experiences within curriculum design. We should be able to do that.
Yeah, very much so. And I'm in danger of straying into another topic here, but I think that it's just, as you were saying that, it reminds me of the importance of creating a held space for learners, because if you're going to intentionally create gaps and uncertainty as a very deliberate learning maneuver, all your other stuff's got to be on point. You know, your onboarding's got to be great. That if you're going to ask learners to suspend their disbelief and give you trust you to take them on a journey, then you've got to make sure, like in a film, you've just got to make sure that it all makes sense at the end. It can't just be there's some gaps in the middle and we hope it's all right. It's like, no, the whole thing needs to be thought through. And again, this idea of the learning designer as editor, I think, is really interesting, because it is then about curating the end-to-end experience, right from first contact right through to the final shot. And then you can take learners into gaps and produce uncertainty and scenarios and ambiguity, in the knowledge that it will all resolve in the end.
Well, that's absolutely right, because and again, we talk about this a lot around maybe this is all we're talking about really today, which is intentionality. It's to be intentional. I always think, because I hear a lot of squeamishness from educators, and it's because I think they are worried perhaps around inclusivity and accessibility and issues of anxiety and students experiencing X or Y and things having to be incredibly kind of like very predictable and all of those things. Yeah. And I know there's a chilling effect there, and that chilling effect unfortunately gets kind of dovetailed with all sorts of boring stuff around identity politics and yada 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 yada, all the stuff that makes sort of the HE space seem incredibly complex and like a world of no, a world of we can't do that and we can't do this and so on and so forth. But when I think about film, when I think about films are films have no responsibility really, other than to in a way have a surface tension and that makes sense. And so you can, in your first act, make people uncomfortable. You can work with unsympathetic characters. You can do all of those things, but you do it in the knowledge that the editor or that the sort of the universe that you're in is, as you say really nicely, a held space. And I think that if when you go into a film, you know that you may be confronted. You may meet provocative or challenging ideas. And you do that by saying, well, this is a certificate, this is an 18 film, or this is this type of film, or that you have genre expectations, or whatever it is. But there are ways that you can scaffold the experience going in. And I honestly think that, as you said, that if you're going to move towards these more juxtaposed, problematizing learning experiences that seem to be the thing that is most asked for, you do have those responsibilities to take people with you. But I think you have to have confidence in that space. But I think really good onboarding, really clear expression, and then when people watch a film and they're in a space that is both like life but not. I think university or courses are like life but not. So yes, you can sort of disrupt and produce unpredictable. You can produce turbulence, but in the knowledge that it's a roller coaster, or that it's a genre. You're having a project brief that's about producing feelings of unpredictability, and you say that out loud, and you design for it responsibly. I cannot believe it is beyond our wit and wisdom to build safe spaces which aren't boring spaces, that aren't sort of corseted. They need to be held, though, and I think that I'm sure. And that's where I do think there's a lot of parity between learning design and editing and film. Well, I would say that because that's I borrow from film all the time, but film is about producing an effect in the mind of someone who you are not there to tell them how to feel. Yeah. You're not there to say, hey, feel this at this moment. It has to be in the experience. It's nowhere else. And we've always said before, it has to be in the course. The course is where it is, right? It's nowhere else. It's in the course. And so course design and curriculum design, I mean, what a powerful act, what a powerful and imaginative act to produce those conditions.
Yeah, it's absolutely. We've had a couple of comments in the chat there, which I've just seen. So someone said, it reminds me of the quote, if everything's important, then nothing's important, which I think is really interesting. So again, yes, the editor, the role of the editor in just taking things out as much as leaving things in, super important. And Joel there, thanks, Joel, just shared the reference to the Hitchcock adaptation of the Kuleshov effect. Thanks for sharing that, Joel. Yeah. So I think you're right. I think there's another discussion coming out of this, is the role of the learning designer as editor, which I think we can get into. But yeah, just I think this idea of the Kuleshov effect just has really opened up some interesting conversations around the role of gaps and intentionality in held spaces and onboarding and juxtaposing and what happens when learners happen to a space. So yeah, really interesting one, Phil. Thank you for.
I just want to say I think it's a confidence thing, and I'll always say that because I sometimes feel that confidence, certainly in teaching spaces, is sometimes harder to manifest and to keep than you would think. You have a lot of subject matter, you have a lot of expertise, a lot of kind of discipline, sort of bolstering from your discipline. You've been doing something a long time. But my big experience around when I was sort of in the trenches was hemorrhaging of confidence around things in a way, and the confidence to facilitate more and to teach less. I think some people look at that like that's an impossible thing. That's like a magic trick. I think it's a confidence piece, really. Yeah. And to know that the combination of two shots has produced an effect. I think about and this is not for you, Tony, but I think about jump scares. I think about jump scares in movies, right? Jump scares are, this kind of mechanical act of kind of withholding, giving information, withholding information, holding the space, framing something to produce an effect, and then delivering. And it's just bits of film. It's just montage, but that effect is powerful. And I think, we haven't talked about montage, montage as a structure. All film is montage, it's just a collection of things. But I think that, maybe it's just me thinking that life is a movie, but I did think it would be very helpful if learning designers thought of themselves as sort of making films sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there's another discussion in there. So we'll tune in next week for metaphorical links between learning design and film.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, thanks, Phil. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. If you're watching the recording, thanks for watching to the end. We appreciate it. You can check out more recordings of Phil's and my fascinating Friday discussions on our blog, where we do try and explore all sorts of different facets and perspectives on learning design. So do check us out at ding.global. Okay.